Dr. AYLWYN SCALLY, thanks so much for coming on to Evolutionsoup from your office in Cambridge, right here in the UK. You are a researcher in human evolutionary genetics at the University of Cambridge, using computational methods with large-scale genetic data to focus on human and primate evolution. Today we'll be looking at your research showing how modern humans descended from not one, but at least two ancestral populations that drifted apart and later reconnected. Welcome to the show, AYLWYN. Well, it's only been a few weeks since you and your colleagues published this paper, so what has the reaction been so far within the scientific community?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me on. It's been very interesting. It's the kind of paper which touches on quite a lot of different fields, not just our own field, which you might say is sort of genetics, population genetics, and human evolution, human evolutionary genetics, but also there's lots of related fields, people working on anthropology, paleoanthropology, so people interested in human fossils, and people interested in other species too, because to some extent the kinds of methods that we've developed here have application not just in humans but in lots of other species to similar kinds of questions about what happened in the deep evolutionary past, because it's a period of human evolution which is difficult to get evidence for. So it's exciting to have some new potential ways of digging into that period in the past.
Well, before we trace the origins of the lineage of modern humans, let's just hear a little bit about your background. AYLWYN, where did you grow up, and what led you to this incredible work that you're doing today, which includes, I believe, sequencing the gorilla genome?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I grew up in Dublin, in Ireland. That's where I'm from. Although we lived a little bit in London for a while when I was growing up, but that's where I was when I went to university as well in Dublin. At that time, I studied theoretical physics. That was my undergraduate degree. I was very interested in all the fundamental questions in physics, and finding out and understanding the universe, and that was a very exciting degree. And I went on from there, in fact, to do a PhD here in Cambridge. So that was when I came to Cambridge for my PhD in astrophysics. And in that, I worked on questions related to the formation of planetary systems like our own. So, how do stars like the sun, how are they born, and how do planets form around them? And I think you can sort of see there an interest in our deep origins, or certainly sort of how the story of how we got to where we are today, going back very far in time. You could argue that to some extent it's the same story as the sort of research that I'm looking at, or that we've worked on here. And that, but just looking much further back in time, as it were. I should say, actually, the move into genetics, which is something I did after my PhD, and in fact after working as a physicist for a little while. Initially, it might strike you as or might strike one as an unusual move, in that the fields are very different, and often people go into one or the other, and there isn't a lot of overlap. But actually, this area that I'm working in here in genetics, which is a sort of dealing with large human data sets, genomic data sets, working with mathematical models of how genomes evolve and how populations evolve. That actually is very much, it's a mathematical sort of a subject, and it's much more familiar to somebody from a physics background like myself. And as a result, it's not so unusual, in fact, to find people from physics coming into this field and working in it and developing models in it. So that was sort of the path I took through after my PhD. I as I say, worked as a physicist, but I was always had always been interested in human evolution as a question and as a sort of a focus for scientific research. And the opportunity arose actually to switch fields and to work on some of the really exciting genetic data sets that were starting to appear. And this is going back about 15 years now. I mean, at that point, the human genome had already been sequenced. So there had already been this amazing revolution, had already been kicked off. But really, what was almost equally important, in fact, is that project was the development of new genome sequencing technologies that made genome sequencing hundreds, thousands of times even cheaper and more and much easier to do and much quicker. And that's really what's facilitated the sequencing of people from all over the world and enabled a whole new approach to doing genetics and to understanding the nature of genetic diversity in humans and obviously potentially in other species. And it was, along with that comes the need to handle large amounts of data and to deal with the computational problems that arise in there. And that's where the sort of window of opportunity arose for people like me to kind of move in and switch fields and start working. And as you mentioned, one of the first projects that I did work on was actually putting together a genome sequence for the gorilla. We already had at that point a human genome sequence constructed at enormous cost back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And then we also had a chimpanzee genome. And the next obvious one to do, you might say, was the gorilla genome. And the reason being that by comparing, the main motive for doing these kind of things was that by comparing the genome of one species to that of another, you can learn about how they evolved, what differences make what differences make one species unique or different from another. Could you see the genetic origins of those differences in their genome sequences? So in order to do that, you have to have a full assembled whole genome of the gorilla, and that was the first project that I worked on in this field. It took a few years to do, and it was a very complicated project, but it was one in which I learned a lot about genomics and about genetics.
Just recently, March 2025, you and your colleagues, Dr. Trevor Cousins and Dr. Richard Durbin, published a paper in Nature Genetics. Before we dissect this research, can you give us an overview of the project?
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll start by taking a somewhat broader look in sort of the context of this study, which is the question of how did humans evolve? What did human ancestors look like, and where were they? And these are big questions that people have been thinking about for a very long time. And you could argue that the first person to think about it in an evolutionary context was unsurprisingly was Darwin. And he, partly because he was the first person to develop an evolutionary framework. And pretty soon afterwards, he started thinking about the origins of humans. And at that point, his ideas, the basis for his ideas was really comparisons with these other species, with chimpanzees and gorillas, our closest evolutionary cousins. And already at that point, he was able to speculate that because those species were in Africa, that maybe that was also where humans evolved. At that point, there wasn't really any fossil evidence, and that only started to appear in the subsequent decades. And in fact, over the next sort of century, people started finding fossil examples of fossils that looked plausibly like our own ancestors. And people started to sort of be able to frame this idea of a species of Homo sapiens and other species that are closely related, like Neanderthals, Homo erectus. But certainly the picture again became very clear over that century that the earliest fossils that look like our own ancestors, that look like Homo sapiens, are all found in Africa as well. So again, lending support to this idea that our deep ancestors, and we're talking about going back several 100,000 years, those ancestors were all in Africa when Homo sapiens evolved, or as Homo sapiens evolved. And then for a long time, that was the only evidence that we had, until around about, well, I suppose you could say the first genetic evidence starts appearing in the 1960s, was in the 80s and 90s, 1980s, 1990s, when we started to get more genetic evidence from modern day humans. And that genetic evidence again pointed to, on the basis of genetic diversity and by constructing sort of simple models of human evolution, that our ancestors were in Africa, and that we had lots of common ancestry around that time, several 100,000 years ago. The question really remained, though, was what did humans look like in terms of what kinds of groupings did they live in? For example, today we know that humans, and we can see that humans live in different populations all around the world. Was that true in the past? Or an alternative possibility, which we didn't really know about, and that's what we're kind of exploring in this paper, an alternative possibility would be that actually, no, that if you go back several 100,000 years ago, all of our ancestors might be all living in a relatively small region, one small part of Africa. And that was, you could point to as, say, the cradle of Homo sapiens, of human ancestry at that time. I mean, obviously, there's no actual beginning to any of this. Those people also had ancestors, and you keep going back further along. But nevertheless, was there a kind of a period at that time where all of our ancestors were in one place, and might that have been an important factor in human evolution? Or is the alternative something more like we see today, but albeit maybe still constrained within Africa, but not just one population, but lots of different populations, maybe separate to differing degrees, maybe quite separate from each other, or maybe exchanging genes, migrating between each other at some very low rate, but nevertheless clearly distinct populations in the way that humans could be described today. And so that's the sort of the question behind this paper. And I guess to jump to our main finding is that we do find that it's the latter case that seems to fit better, we can say that a model where there are at least two populations around that time, sort of several 100,000 years ago, and in particular between about 300,000 years ago, all the way back to well over 1 million years ago, that it looks like human ancestors, the ancestors of present day humans, can be found in not just one, but at least two different populations, probably in Africa, but that's a question that one would have to sort of dig into a little bit further to really answer.
Well, it's safe to say that the scientific models for the human family tree have changed considerably over the years, at one time being quite linear, only to later become much more complex. Aylwyn, what were some of those early ideas, and how has science come to recognize the flaws in those ideas?
I mean, we start to you're dealing with a period still where it's fair to say it's very hard to get evidence, and so a lot of ideas are still up in the air about this, even after you know lots of studies like our own and others that have doing their best to shed as much light as we can. So I don't think that one could say there are relatively few ideas that we can say that we know are definitely not true. The most obvious example of a theory that we certainly think is wrong now, but which used to be held to be quite plausible, is what's called the multi-regional hypothesis of human evolution. And that's one in which the populations that we see, all of humans that we see today all around the world, that they largely evolved sort of in situ, in that, to put that another way, that the ancestors of present day Africans would mostly have been in Africa, but the ancestors of present day people in East Asia, say, would mostly have been in East Asia. So there would have been connections between them, lots of migration and gene flow between them over time. It's not that these were completely separate, but nevertheless, that's what there was a sort of a hypothesis that was how humans all around the world evolved, and that this kind of present day structure extended all the way back into the past, certainly for a million years or so. And we're fairly confident that is not true. All of our ancestors, the ancestors of everybody alive today, all over the world, would have been in Africa. Almost all of it in Africa, should we say? I mean, there's a couple of exceptions I'll touch on in a second, but almost all of the ancestry would have been in Africa by the time you get back to, say, certainly 150,000 years ago or more. And bearing in mind that we start to see Homo sapiens fossils appearing, say, 2 to 300,000 years ago, depending on what you want to classify as a Homo sapiens. That's also not entirely a settled idea. The reason that we have modern Homo sapiens all around the world today is because there was this episode about 50 or 60,000 years ago when our ancestors left Africa and spread around the world in this out of Africa model. Now, there's been a couple of sort of small adjustments to that model since. We do know, for example, that when our ancestors left Africa, they encountered other human forms such as Neanderthals and closely related sister species, Denisovans, and they interbred with them. And the consequences of that is that lots of people today. Pretty much everybody outside Africa has some small fraction of ancestry which comes from Neanderthals. So that has sometimes been framed as a little bit of this multi-regional idea coming, kind of creeping back in, but it really is at a very low level and not um, really quite different from the idea as it used to be. And I think also people have then sort of when we zoom into to focus on this ancestry within Africa, what did it look like in Africa several 100,000 years ago? I think there has been a tendency, it probably stems from sort of deep-rooted ideas of representing human ancestry as a tree. And if you do that, a tree always comes down. Eventually, everything comes down to a single kind of branch or a single sort of main branch at the root or toward at the top, depending on, or at the bottom, depending on which way up you're thinking. And that tree, which is a representation of ancestry, has tended to sort of, I think, guide people towards thinking of human populations more generally as being related in that way, so that not just the ancestry of people, but also that the populations of humans alive would also have been all in a single bunch, a single branch or lineage once you get back to that time. And actually, that's not necessarily true at all. Those are the diagrams that people have drawn representing sort of the origins of humans. But there could have been lots of structure, lots of different populations alive back at that time, and we wouldn't have known about it. We wouldn't have been able to detect it because it would still have looked the same in terms of the present day ancestry. So, people studying fossils and looking at the fossils can see that there are lots of different characteristics in those fossils, that they don't all look the same. We don't find them all in one place in Africa. We find them. A lot of them are found in East Africa and South Africa, but that's partly because it's easier to find fossils there. So it's not clear that that's really where all our ancestors would have been. And then more recently, some plausibly Homo sapiens fossils have been found in North Africa, Northwest Africa, and maybe we will find more in West Africa and other parts as well. So that picture has also been emerging, that maybe there was a bit more diversity than people used to think. So that's why I think that a lot of these questions are still up in the air as to actually where were our ancestors? Were they all in one place in Africa? Were they in different parts? Were even some of them outside Africa at this time? That's something that we also can't rule out. Maybe we'll touch on that in a moment. That's also something that our model might potentially sheds light on as well. So there's a lot of things that are still up in the air about this. I would say it's an exciting time to be in the field because we are getting more and more evidence, and genetic evidence as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get even clearer answers about some of them, over the coming years.
You and your colleagues used a computational algorithm that modeled how ancient humans split apart and later came back together. How exactly does this process work, and what were the results?
Well, I'll try and give you a sense of what the kind of evidence that this method is using, and to some extent how it's doing it. I should say there's a long, or relatively long now. I mean, this field is I guess not an old one. It's been going for a few decades. But in that time, people have developed successively more complicated models and computational methods for trying to extract information from the genomes, from human genomes and other genomes. So, so this, to some extent, is the latest in a lineage of models that we've developed. That we're adding more and more details, and I'm sure there'll be more complicated and more sophisticated ones to come in the future. So basically, the basis for this approach, and the reason that we can get this information, is because everybody inherits two copies of each chromosome. One from your father, one from your mother. And although those two chromosomes are very similar, they're not exactly the same. There's differences between them. And those differences are carrying information about ancestry, about the ancestry of that individual, of you, for example. Now, in some places in your genome, those differences go back to recent ancestors. So these are ancestors that are common to you, people in your immediate family. So they sort of tell that those are telling the sort of story of the ancestry that's unique to you. But in a lot of other places in the genome, those differences go back to ancestors that are shared by many or even all people alive today. You know, that's the sort of the story, the shared story of ancestry, which is actually what most of ancestry is about. Is something that all of us are sharing. And there's even some places in the genome that actually some differences, ancestry differences in every individual's genome that go back all the way hundreds of thousands of years back to this time when Homo sapiens were appearing in Africa and even further back, in fact. And what this method is doing is looking at those. It's focusing in particular on those bits of the genome that are really go back to really old bits of ancestry. And it's looking at the distribution of those, the pattern of those places in the genome, how long they are, where they are, because that information actually, it turns out, can tell us something about the kinds of populations that there were back then, how big they were, how many there were, under an appropriate sort of mathematical model for how the genome has evolved since then. And so that's what it's doing. It's using sophisticated models of evolution in general, and trying to extract this information about about human populations deep in the past. And so that's on the basis of that is how we find, how we infer that the model which seems to fit best is one in which from about 1.5 million years ago to 300,000 years ago, our ancestors were living in at least two groups. And in general, the way that one has to proceed, in fact, with all of these, because I mentioned that's the model that fits best, and that's usually how you have to proceed in these cases. You have to compare how well different models do in explaining the kind of data that you see today, and then you end up going, for the one that fits best. But you also have to do a little bit more clever than that. You have to say, well, does it fit sufficiently better for me to be convinced by it? I mean, because in general, when you use the more complicated a model you use, the more the easier it is to be able to get it to fit to a particular signal. So you have to sort of make an allowance for that, and you have to convince yourself that even though you've used a more complex model, it's a sufficiently better match to the data than the slightly simpler one or than the alternative that you're looking at. So that's essentially what this method is doing, and it's using techniques that have been developed over the last few decades in population genetics. There's one thing I wanted to touch on, which is that the nature of genetic evidence, which is that really it tells us about our ancestry, and it's telling us about potentially how many ancestors there were at a given time and what their relationship to each other was. But what it doesn't tell us at all is where they lived. Genetic evidence really doesn't tell us anything about that. The only geographical information that you might have really is from where people are living today. But in this, and that can sometimes be very helpful, because if you're looking at things that are happening more recently, you can say, well, I see this signal in people over in Asia, and I see this signal in people in Europe, and therefore that tells me about something about maybe where these particular ancestors lived. The problem is when you're going back as far back as we are in this study, we're going back to a point in time when essentially all of us share this ancestry. So every single one of us is descended from a mixture of these two populations. And let's say it's two for the purposes of argument now. I mean, it may have been more than this, but our model represents two populations that came together about 300,000 years ago in a mixture of about 80-20, so 80% from one population, 20 from another. And from that group, from that mixture, all of us today around the world descend. So we can't use the distribution of humans today as a sort of a guide to tease out differences between where people lived back then. With one exception, I should say, which is that I mentioned that there is some Neanderthal ancestry and Denisovan ancestry in all of non-Africans, and so that does go back far enough, because Neanderthals diverged from other humans around about 500,000 years ago. That's something that has been known for a while based on other comparisons. And so it turns out that particular little bit of ancestry does allow us to say something about these two populations. We can say that one of these two ancient populations seems a little bit closer. We can compare it and we can measure, and it's a bit closer to Neanderthals than the other one. And that suggests that one of these two populations is the one from which humans and Neanderthals diverged, or human ancestors and Neanderthal diverged, and the other population perhaps had less contact with these Neanderthal ancestors. And so that maybe suggests that one of these populations was living potentially outside Africa, because Neanderthals were all subsequently found outside Africa, or maybe in the north, sort of eastern part of Africa, from which Neanderthals then left and went around the world. So there are some potential sort of scraps of evidence we can piece together about where these populations might have lived, but it's very much at the level of sort of interpretation and somewhat conjecture.
AYLWYN, could you elaborate on how our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, fit into this research?
Yeah, so the Neanderthals are this other group of humans, let's call them. I mean, we can kind of think more. We can think broadly about Homo sapiens and its evolutionary cousins as all being humans. Some may use a different terminology, but that tends to be the one that's quite common, certainly in population genetics, is to use that term. In more technical terms, they're all members of the genus Homo. And Neanderthals are this other group, and they're all found largely in sort of Europe into Western Asia. By the end of their time, actually, they're sort of dotted around in small populations, very fragmented, and they disappeared. Neanderthals disappeared around about, within the last sort of before the last ice age, or around that time, perhaps a little bit earlier. Denisovans are another closely related species, a sister group, species group, whatever, have the same common ancestor, derived from modern humans around the same time. They subsequently split from Neanderthals. Denisovans seem to be found further east, in East Asia, into sort of southern Siberia, and perhaps down into Southeast Asia. I mean, that's an evolving story, because people are finding more and more evidence of Denisovans each year. That those two groups are our closest, now extinct, but our closest evolutionary cousins, as it were, within the genus Homo. And we know a lot more about them than any of the others, such as Homo erectus and other groups that are also found. Homo erectus was another earlier group that also left Africa and went into Europe and Asia, basically into Asia, and that's where they're found. But that was about 1 million years earlier, and we haven't been able to get any more about them than just looking at their fossils. But with Neanderthals and Denisovans, we also have their genomes. And that was an amazing discovery, an amazing breakthrough that was made about 15 years ago now, to actually get a genome sequence from Neanderthal fossils. And that's that's absolutely transformative in terms of our ability to understand human evolution, because now it's like opening up a new sort of new wave band. For astronomers, it's like a new window onto the universe. This is like being able to look directly into the past, and get a genome sequence from that time, sort of in this case, tens of thousands of years ago. And several Neanderthal genome sequences have been managed to have been obtained at this point. So we're building up a small picture of what Neanderthal genetics looked like. And one of the things we can do is compare those Neanderthal genomes with modern human genomes, and try to see how long. Well, first of all, how long ago did they diverge? Can we construct models of the ancestors, the common ancestors of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals? In the case of our study, since what our method does is identifies different regions of the genome that go back hundreds of thousands of years, and potentially come from one or the other of these two population subgroups, the two sides of this structure that we've identified. We can actually compare those regions. In our paper, we call them A and B, not terribly imaginatively, and we find that the A population, the one that contributed 80% of ancestry to all of our to everybody alive today, those regions seem a little bit closer to the Neanderthal genome than the other group. the regions from this bee population. And so that is telling us something about potentially something about where some of these populations might have been. If you think that Neanderthals diverged, Neanderthals, if you think that divergence happened outside Africa, then that means that this population A must have been outside Africa at that time. If you think it diverged inside Africa, well, then obviously they could have been in Africa, but maybe they could have been, as I said, somewhere towards the exit, from towards the to Arabia, Northeast Africa, that kind of part of the world. So that's kind of interesting, because obviously that starts to have some bearing on people's interpretation of fossils that we might find at that time and what kind of groups there would have been. Another interesting thing that we did see is that in this population A, which is the sort of the majority contributor to human ancestry today, when it shortly after those two groups split, which was about 1.5 million years ago, there actually seems to have been quite a sharp bottleneck, by which is a term we use to mean that the population size got very small. So it then recovered. So it grew again, and so by the end, population A may have been quite a large population. It's not entirely clear how big they were, but it certainly seems clear that there was a very sharp reduction in population size immediately after or shortly after the split. And that there are lots of reasons why that can happen, but one of them is that there's a sort of a migration, a movement from one region to another, which necessarily sort of reduces the number of people, number of ancestors, to a smallish group of founders, as we tend to call them. I mean, that kind of imagery is sometimes a bit misleading. It conjures up sort of image of a group of people kind of adventuring somewhere and deliberately setting out and founding a new population or something. It doesn't have to be anything like that. This all could have been happening on a very slow time scale, and just a sort of almost not terribly perceptible to people at the time, but nevertheless a reduction in genetic diversity, just because there was a gradual movement, migration away over multiple generations. These processes could all be happening relatively slowly. But nevertheless, it's left a signal in the genetic, in the patterns of genetic data that we can detect. And so that maybe also lends some credence to the idea that this population A might have had a period outside Africa, or certainly in a different part of Africa from population B, and perhaps from other ancestors. So these are kind of bits of evidence that we can start to use, we can put together and maybe grope our way towards a richer picture of human ancestry in this deep evolutionary past.
Well, it's very important work that you and your colleagues are doing, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on to the show today. So, what's next for you, AYLWYN? Any new projects that you can tell us about?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. As I said, it's a very exciting time in the field of human evolution, because we're now at a stage where we're to some extent drowning in data. There are more human genomes sequenced than we could have possibly dreamed of sort of 10, 20 years ago. And that means there's lots of questions that we can address, and some of it will be continuing along the same kind of lines as this study. Questions about the sort of structure of human ancestry, trying to construct more realistic, more complicated models to tease out questions that we might have about how and when humans got to various parts of the world. But to some extent, I think we're also moving into a new regime where we're interested actually in more kind of local questions, perhaps even more recent questions. I mean, the nature of the subject is that we've initially been talking about these really big, old questions in human evolution, but actually a lot of interesting things, the kinds of questions actually maybe that historians rather than archaeologists or rather than paleoanthropologists are interested in. Historians are interested in things that happened much more recently, and for those to bring genetic evidence to bear and to try and help flesh out some of those questions, we need to develop new methods and new approaches. And so that's something I'm also have an interest in doing. And so there are various sort of projects underway, sort of working on focusing on kind of smaller areas, like just within parts of Europe, just looking at the relationships between, say, the islands of Britain and Ireland, and our neighbours in northwest Europe, and can we say something about the sort of the pattern of movement of people between those parts of the world and within them, and can we move beyond this kind of idea of just populations as a big blob of people all identical, but actually trying to think about individuals living in a landscape, um, moving around, having children with each other, much more complex pictures of society. And I think genetic evidence can shed some light on some questions that will be of interest to people in that context.
AYLWYN SCALLY, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and really enjoy chatting about these kinds of things. And it's always good to try and have a stab at explaining as much as we can, and bringing some of these ideas to a wider audience.